Modernism, right? It's a massive umbrella of a movement. We'll see that there are a lot of different smaller literary movements that fall under its gigantic umbrella, but it wasn't only just a literary movement, it was an artistic movement, right? So that's why we're going to briefly talk about a couple paintings and film and etc. before we actually get into more of the literary aspect of it, right? So this is a painting called Flag Station, Elizabeth, New Jersey by Oscar Blumner. It was finished in 1925. So Blumner studied painting and architecture in Berlin, and he immigrated to the United States in the 1890s. So during the first decade of the 20th century, he worked primarily as an architectural draftsman, but shifted to painting after studying theories of color and spending time in New York galleries and museums. Flag Station combines his various skills and passions in one small page-sized watercolor, right? So this is a small watercolor piece. Was influenced by the sensual color use of French Impressionism as well as the emotional drama of the later art movement known as German Expressionism. So, what Blumner's doing is he's using colors to capture more complicated feelings and emotions of place, right? Um, the painting itself incorporates disturbingly leaning architectural forms, very vibrant dark blues and deep reds in one modest night landscape, right? We have no figures present, but the edge of the train depot in a New Jersey suburb becomes an unexpected spot of repressed drama. So this is a great example of a modernist piece, right? Modernists, as we will discuss further in a minute, were breaking from tradition, and that's one of the main aspects of modernism. And when we get to Pound, we'll see how that becomes problematic. Because it's hard to reject everything that's come before you in a literal sense. Conceptually or idealistically, that does work, right? You know, you're breaking from the old and working with the new and doing something that no one's done before. Now, the issue that more traditional painters had with this piece was that they argued it looked like a sketch. It didn't look finished, right? But, it is more about a mood and a tone than anything else, right? This is a very kind of desolate, empty piece. And we'll talk about this idea of isolationism, really, that has a lot to do with modernism as well. A second art piece painting is going to be Edward Hopper's Nighthawks from 1942. It's stylized realism, right? But it preserves traditional perspective, accentuated by the deep view through the restaurant's large plate glass window, but simplifies both realistic detail and painterly brushwork. In both style and subject, Hopper's painting is often compared to the work of writers like Hemingway and to the visual style of 1940s film noir, right, which means dark film. And again, you know, we're seeing something a little bit more sparse here than more traditional pieces of art. Things are getting broken down and reworked in a lot of ways. Um, and Hopper would argue kind of boiled down to their essence. And again, we'll see how that falls into play into modernist literature in a second. Um, so, American literature and modernism. Um, some of the main points to consider about modernism is tradition versus innovation, right? So, how do artists use tradition or break free from tradition to be innovative, to create something new that people have never seen before? Um, Obviously, this comes into massive play with film because we didn't have film, right? Didn't have moving pictures until, at least that were accessible to the masses until around this time. There's also a question of serious versus popular literature. You know, um, we kind of touched this concept when looking at Jack London, right? The idea that he didn't go to an Ivy League school and didn't spend his upbringing um, and young adult academic life stuffed into a library. He was out there meeting people, and you also need to consider, more people are gaining access to literature now. More people are literate, right? So, excuse me. um, you know, it really boils down to the idea of gatekeeping, right? What is considered popular, what's considered serious. Um, the two paintings we looked at, especially the first one, would not be considered a serious work of art by um, traditional critics and academics at the time, even though it quickly becomes accepted, you know. So how do we deem something, worth being studied in a class as opposed to just being for fun, right? That's an argument that can be made even with our anthology, right? I would argue, especially as we get into the later end of the semester, that the anthology really is kind of lacking um, very important popular literature. Now, we have one instance of a comic book at the end, which would obviously be considered pop literature. But this is the time that really starts to get questioned, and artists of any vein, you know, buck up against the system and are like, why can't this be considered art, right? You know, and it's an idea that we see from our first lecture with Emily Dickinson, right? Dickinson's work was rejected by most publishers because it broke form, right? It was doing something new. And that's an instance where we see Dickinson as a massive innovator in American literature, right? And again, remember at the time, people were like, "Oh, you're a woman. You don't understand it all the fully, right? Like you're just not good enough of a writer to come up with these perfect end rhymes and meter." But that's not the point, right? She proved that in her plethora of letters throughout her life, is that she was trying to do something new and didn't see the point of being completely constrained to a particular form, even though we know that she did work very formally. Um, that's one person, right? Then we have Walt Whitman, who, kind of goes the opposite direction with free verse. And like we said, it's not like Leaves of Grass was particularly heralded when it came out, nor did it really sell. And he self-published it because no one wanted it. But they're front runners of this more kind of modern explosion. So if it's a couple people, it's easy to dismiss. But when you have an entire movement um, of artists accepting these ideas, you can no longer dismiss them, right? They're out there. So, modernism refers to artistic work that represents the transformation of traditional society under the pressures of modernity. It breaks down traditional literary forms, right, which we've already kind of started to see. We'll see it much more as our weeks move forward. It has depicts the modern world not, excuse me, as a triumph of human civilization, but as an experience of loss, right? And this has a lot to do with World War One and World War Two, and it calls into question the religious, political, social, and artistic conventions of the past, right? So the idea of calling into question in the sense of, what is their importance, right? You know, why do these ideas really matter anymore? This is a modern era. Shouldn't we be looking forward? And it interprets the world as disparate fragments rather than integrated whole. And that has to do with the idea of being isolated in a modern world, which, let's say, is something that we deal with much more because of, you know, cell phone use, etc., right? We're around people all the time, but we still feel isolated. And that's a very old concept. Um, it's a modern concept, really, but it was a concept that existed even before that. There's this French idea called the Flaubert, and it's the man about town, right? And Edgar Allan Poe wrote a lot of stories and essays in that vein, as well as some other famous French writers, but it has to do with the idea of being in a modern urban city and being isolated even though you're surrounded by, thousands of people. Um, if any of you ever end up moving to a big city, it's a real feeling. I lived in New York for 10 years, and you're surrounded by millions of people, but you don't feel like you're around anyone if you don't have a core, group of friends or family around you. Um, so the list of these features of modern art and literature isn't really exhaustive, nor is it entirely coherent, right? I mean, this is a random list of ideas, but that's very much so like modernism. And it's a good place to start differentiating between the modernist literature of the 20th century and the realist naturalism of the late 19th century. Not every work of modernist art or literature displays all of these qualities, right? So that's something to keep in mind, which is also why it can become a little confusing or problematic, but they may display some of them. And some work emphasizes one aspect much more than another. So it's worth taking some time to define the genre and purpose of what a manifesto is, right? So the word manifesto, derived from Latin and meaning to make public, first entered English usage in the 17th century to describe printed declarations of belief and advocacy, which is exactly what these modernist manifestos are. But early manifestos tended to be weapons forged by dissenting groups in religious and political struggles, a tradition that continued far into the 19th century. Um, Now, this comes from Mina Loy's from her Feminist Manifesto. One of the most immediately noticeable features of Loy's manifesto is its typography, right? She increases the font size at strategic moments, underlines text, puts letters in boldface, and employs irregular capitalization. Um, Now, the thing to consider is, why would she do this, right? Well, if you opened this page, what stands out? It's the bold font, it's the underlining, right? So, what do we have here? Women, wrench, reform, absolute, demolition, no, right? These are what is supposed to stand out. Um, so, a question in a more modernist vein would be, does the message of her text determine the form that it takes, right? She wants this to be in our face, right? And arguably, it is much more so in a literal sense than if it was all just, 12 standard font, right? We're forced visually to take these words into greater consideration for that reason, right? And it's also worth considering how Loy's militaristic language of demolition and destruction recall war and violence. But her pro-feminist message still runs throughout, right? Now, Loy makes flamboyant use of typography, a strategy that came back in radical documents that circulated on college campuses and counterculture neighborhoods in the 1960s, which we will get to in a few weeks. Um, So, what's the thematic and tonal effect of what are really visual cues and flourishes, right? What voice do you hear in this document, and what does it compare to pounds, as we will look at in a second? Pound numbers the items in his manifesto like a list of non-negotiable demands, right? So, you know, you have all of those snippets and excerpts from the Modernist Manifestos that you were supposed to check out, and they're all very different. They're all demanding very different things, right? So, there is a uniformity in the sense of urgency and kind of setting new rules and breaking away from the past, but that really is, you know, what connects them. If not, there isn't that much else that does so. Now, Ezra Pound, um, he was an American expat living in Europe. He was hugely influential in the circle of other expat writers and artists, not only for his own work as a poet, but also for the advice that he offered to other writers. A retrospect is Pound's manifesto on Imagism, a school of poetry that argued for the central, if not defining, place of the image itself in modern poetry. The two Pound pieces that we're going to look at in a station of the Metro and Une Portrait d'une Femme are both, in Pound's eyes, imagist poems. Now, we could debate that. I would say Station in the Metro most definitely is. And, he stretches his ideas to fit what he's doing, which is kind of what Pound has always does. It's also worth noting that regardless of the influential author, an essayist and scholar that Pound was, he was a pretty piece of shit human being. Um, I mean, he was, by the end of his life, essentially a fascist. Um, but that doesn't mean that his earlier work isn't incredibly important in the vein of modernist literature. He's probably one of the most influential and important early modernist writers, which is why we're looking at him. But he's a worthless person. Now, Imagism is a movement in early 20th century English and American poetry which sought clarity of expression through the use of precise images. The movement derived in part from the aesthetic philosophy of T. Hune and involved Pound, James Joyce, Irish writer Amy Lowell, and others. So again, Imagism emphasized simplicity, clarity of expression, and precision through the use of exacting visual images. Now, this is a list of Pound's actual rules for Imagism, right? So, one, we have a direct treatment of the thing, whatever that may be, whether subjective or objective. Two, to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. Well, okay, that's really the point of a well-crafted piece of writing is, right? Writers have to make decisions all the time, whether it is to leave out a section, whether it is to, use an economy of words. That's not a new idea, right? That's the thing, especially with people like Pound that really had a grand sense of self is sure to use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. That's not a new idea, essentially. Now, to the extreme lengths that he took it sometimes was new or modern, but still, this kind of economy of words and choice is been around since people have been writing, right? And is regarding rhythm to compose in sequence of the musical phrase, not in sequence of the metronome. So, that's actually much simpler than it sounds. Um, and it's calling for free verse, right? Because, a metronome keeps time, it keeps rhythm, right? If any of you, play music or grew up playing music of any form, a metronome keeps time. It's a click, right? And you can set it. So what Pound is saying here is that the sequence of the musical phrase, right, what's happening at the moment, rhythmically is more important than a standard set rhythm, right? So all that is doing is calling for free verse and a rejection of formal constraint, right? Which again, Pound surely didn't make up. So, the haiku, right? We've been talking about imagism. Why are we jumping back to the haiku? This is American literature, modern American literature at this point. The haiku was invented in 13th century Japan. Now, it's we are looking at the haiku because as much as Pound pushes forward these ideas of being, completely modern and rejecting the past, a lot of these concepts of, a sparsity of words and language goes back to the haiku, right? Now, yes, it had a strict form, but if we're looking at an economy of words and only, focusing on the thing, as Pound would say, that's what haikus do. And it's not without worth noting that, Pound made it clear in his personal letters and discussions that he did come up with this idea of imagism after reading a ton of haikus, right? So, again, but over the wintry forest, winds howl and rage with no leaves to blow, right? That is an instant in time. It is a singular image, a singular idea. Um, so without getting too much into haiku, um, you know, that's where we see Pound kind of get the idea of imagism from. Now, um, in the station of the metro, right? 2 lines, incredibly short. It's one of Pound's most famous imagist poems. Um, And the question is, does he practice what he preaches essentially in a retrospect, right? In this piece. Are you inclined to think differently about the advice Pound offers in a retrospect? After reading an imagist poem, do you think that a retrospect is offering something more than just general advice? Um, Now, aside from whether you agree with his list of do's and don'ts of writing, what effect does this prescriptive tone have on Pound's voice? Now, an imagist poem, right? The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That's it, right? Um, it is worth noting that in terms of uh, titles, especially when looking at modernist and postmodern poetry, titles become increasingly important and they can become hints, the theme of a poem, what a poem's about, what we're supposed to take away from it, right? Our title here, in a station of the metro, sets the scene, right? It tells us what the poem itself is an image of, right? Um, this could have been untitled, and it would make it so much more up for interpretation, right? If we didn't know the title and all we had was the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, okay, right? But with our title, we know what he's describing, right? He's describing a station of the metro, so a, London subway station. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Well, what's an apparition? It's, the ghostly entity, right? It's something that, can appear a little translucent. So we have the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, right? It's just instant thought. It's a singular image, right? We have the use of the semicolon at the end of the line, and remember, semicolons are one of those, um, you know, should be more scarcely used bit of punctuation, but their purpose is to connect to um, deeply aligned sentences, right? So, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, well, what about them? Petals on a wet black bough, right? So, bough being a thicker tree branch. Now, if you have flower petals on a wet black tree branch, they're kind of plastered on there. They become a little translucent. So that's what we're supposed to take, right? That's all that this is. You can imagine Pound standing in a metro station and just kind of seeing all these like drawn, sullen faces, and they look like petals on a wet tree branch. And that's it. That's the poem. But that's what imagism is. It's an instant in time. And this is probably one of the best, if not the best, examples of most definitely one of Pound's Imagist poems. You take it at face value, you take it for what it is, it's succinct, it's there, right? Pound considered Portrait d'une Femme, which we will look at in a second, to be an Imagist poem as well. And it's interesting to note that if you take Pound's rules for Imagism, it's quite arguable that he's extending and loosening his definitions and rules to kind of fit you know his own agenda, what he's trying to do. Now that's not to say that there's not something important to know the rules enough that you can bend and break them to your advantage to a point. But if you make the rules and then you keep changing them to benefit yourself, what does that say about somebody? Not to say that Portrait d'une Femme isn't a phenomenal piece of writing, but it's a little hard pressed, even though Pound would most definitely argue that it is an Imagist poem.